Hello, everybody. We are joined today once again, by my friend John David Ebert. John David Ebert, or John, he's a cultural critic, right? Or how would you best describe yourself? I'll let you introduce yourself this time. I don't want to.
Oh, no, that's fine. Cultural critic is fine. That's pretty much what it is, with a very strong interest in philosophy, however.
A rogue academic.
A rogue scholar. Definitely not an academic, but a nomad. I specifically avoided going into the university system after I got a BA in English. By that point, I had discovered Oswald Spengler and Joseph Campbell, who were universalists, big picture thinkers, and I knew that that was what I wanted to do. And I knew from Campbell talking about it, and the fact that Spengler chose to teach high school and stay away from academe, I knew it would be trouble. So I avoided it, never was an academic at all, have no interest in having my originality crushed into a box and having the big picture crushed into specialization. So, and I knew that that was what would happen. So I left and went around that and started out as an editor for Joseph Campbell's works in the late 1990s for the Joseph Campbell Foundation. I was working on his posthumous writings. I did that for 5 years. Then I published my first book in 1999, Twilight of the Clockwork God. I was 30 years old. That was kind of a hit, a miniature hit, but still to this day, my most successful book financially, even though it's mostly a New Age book. I've since disavowed the New Age because it's basically nonsense.
Like, when you say New Age, you mean like like the theosophy, or do you just mean
no, not theosophy. No, because
like just the random stuff. Like
Rudolf Steiner started as a theosophist, and then he became disillusioned with them and broke away from them because they couldn't handle his originality and his genius.
So New Age, isn't that like when it's just sort of like the random assortment of things people pull together and just
like Deepak Chopra, Eckhart Tolle, Shirley MacLaine.
I actually do like Eckhart Tolle.
There is, well, it's not like there's nothing to it. They're basically right in their spiritual orientation, but where they go wrong is in their idea that the intellect is a liability and you have to get rid of it. That's dead flat fucking wrong. You don't get rid of the intellect. We have it for a reason. We have it for a reason. It should be cultivated, developed, and nurtured, not done away with. And Eckhart Tolle's main idea is doing away with the mind. The power of now means you're here and your mind is elsewhere. Guess what, though? When I like to take a walk, let's say, I like to not be here. I like to be in my mind, thinking thoughts, ideas for books, stories. I shuffle all kinds of ideas when I'm now on a walk. So Eckhart Tolle is wrong. I totally reject it. And but the book was full of interviews with people. I did interview Deepak Chopra. Back then, I thought he was interesting. Not now. He's a total hack. Terence McKenna, Stanislav Grof, Rupert Sheldrake, Richard Tarnas. They're all hacks. They have some basic ideas right, but they're mediocrities. They haven't developed talent. They don't have talent. Let's just face it. So I got disillusioned with the New Age and went off on my own to work on philosophy. I studied philosophy, the German idealist philosophers, Kant, Schopenhauer, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, Nietzsche, eventually Heidegger. It took a while to work up to Heidegger. Heidegger was very difficult. But I broke through, figured out Heidegger. And so that's what I've been doing. And then, so I've made well over 900, we're approaching 1,000 YouTube videos now, analyzing various different works of philosophy, like Heidegger's Being and Time, or like, The Decline of the West. I did also manage to incorporate and ingest, unlike Jordan Peterson.
I was about to say, Jordan Peterson's one of those guys who started out kind of interesting, and then, it's once they become like celebrities, then they become not interesting.
Which he has not read a word of. You can tell by listening to his caricaturization of French postmodern thought that this guy has not sat down and read through Paul Virilio, Deleuze and Guattari, Foucault. Maybe he's read one or two token Foucault books. Everybody does. No, he hasn't. He's done his homework. I have, and so
I think he kind of conflates. I feel like postmodernism with the Frankfurt School. That's at least.
Yeah. Well, everything's confused with him. He's just a glorified academic. Plus, he doesn't have time to do this. He's an academic and a psychoanalyst. He's written a couple of very bad books, especially the one Maps of Meaning, which I did a YouTube series on it for as long as I could stand it. It was absolutely terrible, terribly written, in bad need of an editor. It was awful. It was one of the worst books I've ever read on the theme of mythology. Basically, a ripoff of The Hero with a Thousand Faces. So
I know he is a big Joseph
much ado
Campbell.
about nothing.
I know he
Much
always talks about Joseph Campbell on his Twitter and stuff. So.
Oh, yeah. Well, somebody probably pointed out to him, as I did when I did the videos, that this is a ripoff of The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and he never once mentions Campbell in that book, Maps of Meaning.
I may have tweeted at him and asked him about Joseph Campbell because I never heard him mention it. Then he all of a sudden started always tweeting about Joseph Campbell. It was kind of funny.
Yeah.
Anyway,
not a fan. Not a fan.
Anyway, anything else you want to say, like to those who?
No, that's it. I've written 30 books on all kinds of different aspects of art, literature, culture, art after metaphysics, the new media invasion, dead celebrities, living icons, a whole bunch of stuff. And now I'm working on creating a school, the John David Ebert School for the Study of Culture, Cosmology, and the Arts. Our first class will begin on May 14th, which is a Saturday at 12 noon MST. And the theme of the class is Transformations of Consciousness Through Time. We will be studying thinkers such as Rudolf Steiner, Sri Aurobindo, Jean Gebser, Eric Neumann, Taylor Desjardins, and Arthur Young. So that will be the inaugural course. So I'm working on that. That's eating up all my time right now. So.
Okay. Are you planning on making that into potentially like a charter school in the future? Like
it might.
Similar to like a Waldorf, like the Waldorf type thing that Steiner did?
Yeah, it's an experiment. It just all depends. We'll see where it goes.
Well, wish you the best of luck in there. I'm definitely going to be following that closely. And
because we have, I have lots of ideas for courses. I think if this one is a success, we're going to do a class on Friedrich Nietzsche next, where we'll read all of Nietzsche's main books, the 5 main ones or 6. We'll go through that. We'll also do classes on the history of Islamic art, the history of Russian literature, all kinds of good stuff. So it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely. And I definitely urge all those in my audience to take a look at that too. And also, if you have the money, donate to his Patreon also. He makes fantastic content.
I would appreciate that. I also have a Substack site that I write about 1 essay a week on Substack.
And I know you used to have your website. I haven't seen it updated. Like I think the last thing you wrote was joking.
Because the website was culturaldiscourse.com, and there's no money involved there. On Substack, people have to pay $5 a month, so there's actual money. So I'm not just wasting my time, giving things away for free. Casting pearls before swine was what I was doing on my previous site. So I deserve to be paid for my work. So that's what Substack is all about.
I actually didn't know that that's what Substack was. I just thought it was like some place people would. I thought it was like a blog.
No, the whole point of it
it sounds like only fans for writing.
Yeah, people have to pay. That's the whole point of it.
Yeah. Anyway, so let's get to the topic of today. I mean, it's very relevant to what's going on now. So today we're going to be talking about, in the context of the decline of the decline of the West, and some other philosophical history works too, any others that might come up at some point. We're going to be talking about Spengler's theory and prediction on the rise of a new Russian culture, which back in he saw start to rise back in like the 1500s, but then kind of stifled due to the Western influence. And then he predicted that sometime in the future it would like break out and would forge its own identity. And in a sense, we're starting to see Russia become more aggressive again, trying to break free of its European, not just it's already broken away from like the geopolitical angle of it, but we almost are wondering if but from a more, it's definitely trying to forge like a new imperial identity now that's strangely distinct from both the old European style Russian Empire and the USSR, especially with its, but it still exists like under the veneer of sort of like a Western style system, even though it's a bunch of corrupt oligarchs. But either way, is there anything in particular that you want to start by discussing here? Because I mean, I'm very familiar with Spengler, but you're even more familiar with Spengler specifically on this particular topic, which I've always been confused about. He's always been very vague, at least in my readings of the Russian aspect. But do you think maybe both to me and to the audience, you can explain what his theory is?
Yes. So to recap, Spengler's main idea is that cultures go through phases, and he analogizes the four phases to the seasons. You have a pre-cultural phase, then the springtime phase comes in. In a way, there's five actually, because the pre-cultural phase is before the springtime phase. And the springtime phase is when the culture rises, gets off the ground. This corresponds to the period of our Gothic cathedrals and the formation of a very coherent Faustian worldview. Then it moves into the summer and autumn phases with the early culture phase and the late culture phase, which is when the religious aspect sort of sheds and becomes metaphysical. It's a metaphysical worldview. You get the grand philosophers, starting with Descartes in the West, going on all the way down to Kant, where it climaxes with the German idealists. But just as, let's say, with the Greeks, you get the pre-cultural period with the Mycenaeans, let's say, down to the Trojan War. Then the springtime comes in around 1100 after the dust settles from the Trojan War, and you get the Doric style, the Doric column, the Doric temple, most of which we've lost all that architecture because it was built in wood, as was early Russian architecture as well, built in wood. Mm-hmm. So we've lost a lot. And then, so it goes down with Homer. Homer corresponds to the period of the writing of our epics, our Grail romances, the Scandinavian Eddas, the prose Eddas, the poetic Eddas, and so forth. You get this grand style with this epic vision that comes in the springtime. Then it moves into the period of the philosophers, in our case with Descartes and company, and in the case of the Greeks with the pre-Socratics and so forth, down to the period of Plato and Aristotle for the Greeks, and down to the period of Kant and the German idealists, Hegel, Fichte, Schelling, in our case. Then there's a decline, so that's summer and autumn, let's say the early culture and the late culture period. Then the end phase comes in with what he calls civilization, which is the winter stage, where the culture begins to stiffen up. It loses its metaphysical brilliance, and it begins to become concerned with pragmatic problems, political problems, social problems, economic problems, bread and circuses, feeding the masses, and the city takes over. The city intellect. You get megalopolitan world cities, as in the Hellenistic period following the death of Alexander. Between that and the rise of the Roman Empire, the disintegration of the Roman Republic, civil wars, social unrest, and the city think, which is fundamentally atheistic, based on materialism, based on money. Everything shifts from metaphysical intensivity to shallow extensivity. And then you begin to see the building of universal states, big empires, the coming of the Caesars, and geographical expansion. So with regard to the West now, he sees the West at the tail end. He analogizes us at about the year 2000 with about where the Romans were at the time of the coming of the Caesars and the disintegration of the Republic. And then he says, with regard to Russia, Russia is in its springtime phase, right about the year 1900 to 2000, right in that zone where it's beginning to become assertive of its own unique worldview, and it has to shed the Western pseudomorphosis, which is a false formation, a false influence of an alien culture that was imposed by Peter the Great around the year 1700 with the building of St. Petersburg. After Peter went on a tour of Europe, saw all the culture forms there, and then imported them to Russia to create a port city to get control over the Baltic Sea, but at the same time to rebel against Moscow, which is authentic and real. As far as Spengler is concerned, the spiritual core of Russia lies in Moscow. St. Petersburg is totally artificial, fake, and has no future. I think he was right about that. So he says, too, on his timeline then, that Peter the Great is comparable to Charlemagne. They were both doing a similar thing, just as he says, rewinding back to the birth of the pre-culture period in the West, which is the Merovingian period, right around the year 480 with Clovis. Clovis is the first in the West to begin to see the spark of a new civilization here coming out of the disintegration of the Western Roman Empire with his uniting of the Frankish tribes. He unites the Frankish tribes and then expands them, has a victory over the Visigoths, which he pulls down to the Pyrenees, pushes them down over the Pyrenees. And for the first time, you begin to get a sense that here's the West now. It has an identity, the Franks, which corresponds to Ivan III, not Ivan the Great, but Ivan III in 1480, who does a similar thing in Russia where he pushes the Tatars out once and for all at the Battle of the Ugar River. The Tatars had been Mongols, basically, had been dominant over Russia since 1240, pushes them out, captures Novgorod to the north, which was a huge territory, then comes down and retakes Kievan Rus back from the Mongols who had conquered it in 1240. So a major boundary act in both cases. Then, so
you want to explain what a boundary act is, real quick, just for the
it's my term. It's my term for when the immune system of a culture reacts against an invading culture that it regards as not authentic. Like, for example, the Greeks at Marathon with the 300. That's a boundary act against the Persians. The Persians are trying to absorb the Greeks. Same thing with the Maccabean revolt.
Battle of Vienna.
Boundary act against the Seleucid Greek overlords who were threatening to swap out Yahweh for Zeus in the temple. You can't do that. That's a boundary act. Also, with Charles Martel at the beginnings of the Carolingian dynasty, just before Charlemagne, pushing the Umayyad Arabs south of the Pyrenees. That was a boundary act in 732.
I'd say that's like I'd consider that the symbolic moment the West was formed, personally.
Yes, absolutely. You can put it back to Clovis if you want, or you can ignore that and start with Martel. Depends on where you want to put the emphasis. But with Charlemagne, there's no question about it. 800, he's crowned emperor, the first Western emperor since the Roman Empire by Pope Leo III, and he begins importing all of these scholars. The highest intellects of Europe are drawn in from Spain, from Visigothic Spain, from Ireland, from France, from everywhere you can imagine. He pulls them into his court at Aachen, which is in Germany. Pulls them in, has a palace designed pseudomorphically on the model of a Byzantine palace, and gets Europe up and running with this idea of we're reviving the Roman Empire. This is the Frankish Empire now. And
isn't there also still what's the term, were they still some of the Franks still polygamous at that time too?
Yes.
Even because I know Charlemagne had allegedly had concubines.
It was traditional for the Franks to be polygamous. Probably, though, by the time of Charlemagne, they're probably starting to frown on it. Clovis was the first to convert to Catholicism back in 480. So he did, because up to that point, the Franks were Arian Christians, as were the Visigoths, not Indo-Aryan, but Bishop Arius, whereby it was kind of polytheism because God was regarded as superior to Christ, and Christ was regarded as inferior to God. They weren't exactly consubstantial. So it kind of had a polytheistic residue that appealed to the Visigoths and the early Franks, and Clovis got rid of that.
Isaac Newton.
Yes, exactly. So as I was saying, so Charlemagne is equivalent to Peter the Great. Right around 1703, he builds St. Petersburg, imports all these false European forms, but it does Russia a great favor. It modernizes it, just like with Charlemagne. It raises standards of literacy. He's got all these scholars founding academies and schools and museums and so forth on the model of Europe, and it gets Russia on the map, up and running. Even though it's based on city intellect that's centuries in advance of where Russia was at the time, namely, basically culturally at the level of Charlemagne. Peter the Great was made fun of when he was in Europe. European aristocrats regarded him as a rube and made fun of his rustic manners. So that tells you that the Europeans were way in advance of Russia at this time.
Kind of like how the Egyptians treated the early Greeks.
Yeah, exactly the same. Yes, exactly.
Backwater until Persia. They beat Persia.
Yeah, so that was on Spengler's timeline, his morphology for Russia. So I figured out, when I wrote my recent Substack essay, I said, well, if that were the case, what would Putin represent? Let's say if we fast forwarded the timeline from Peter the Great a few centuries, where would we land? And it looks like to me we would land in the time of Otto the Great, who in about 970 or 950 to 970, right in there, was the first to then revive the Frankish Empire, which had disintegrated due to Charlemagne's grandsons dividing it up into what later became France, Germany, and the Lotharingian corridor that France and Germany have fought over ever since. And he was the first to begin. He established the Holy Roman Empire by taking back a lot of these lands, not the Frankish domain, which became France, but the middle domain, the Lotharingian area, and got it up and running. It became the Holy Roman Empire, and it was a period of great restoration and great success. The Ottonian era, Otto 1, 2, and 3. I see Putin as probably homologous to this on Spengler's timeline. It looks like he's trying to do the same thing by restoring the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, trying to expand it geographically to what it once was. And it looks like he, of course, and this isn't a value judgment. This has nothing to do with morality, ethics, rights, humanitarian interventions, none of that. None of that need apply. That has nothing to do with the facts of history. The facts of history.
The great man, yeah.
Yeah, the great man. And Spengler predicted that communism would fall away in his essay on Russia, which he wrote right around 1920, a couple of years after the Bolshevik Revolution. He knew
because it's just Western Protestantism, essentially.
Yeah, he knew it was fake. He knew it would disintegrate and disappear. He knew its days were numbered. He was 100% correct. And he said Russia's history depends on the appearance of another great personality. And very possibly Putin might fit that role.
Would you say that Stalin, sorry to interrupt for a second, but a quick question before I forget. People like Lenin and Stalin, would you say that they were like Russians, or would you say that they're like basically unwitting Faustians in sort of
unwitting Faustians? Yes, because they're part of the pseudomorphosis, the Western false form influence. And see, the thing there with Stalin is
they would have. So wait, hold up. Would they? So they would have been like the what do you call them? The starts with an S, not the Sasanians. The Greek Empire in the Middle East. So they'd be like the Soviet Union would be like the Seleucids, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they're infected with Western ideas that have nothing to do with Russia. They're city intellectual ideas that have nothing to do with this basically primitive rural Russian population, which is still fundamentally pious, mystical, and religious. And I knew myself that once communism fell away in 1991, that Russia would revert back to Orthodox Christianity if Spengler was right. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. They are in their springtime. They're fundamentally pious and religious, not atheist. And the Cathedral of the Armed Forces, which was finished in 2020, is a testament to that. It looks like one of our Gothic cathedrals. It's huge, it's expansive, it's original, it's innovative and luminous. Third largest cathedral, Orthodox cathedral that Russia has ever built. It's a monster, and it's beautiful and luminous and full of springtime self-confidence. So it all fits. I think Spengler was right about this.
So do you think that, so yeah, actually, so before this year especially, my view, and because I think I mentioned in the past, I was like writing the rough draft of the rough draft of the rough draft of the rough draft of a sort of similar like book based on my idea of the philosophy. It incorporates some Spenglerian stuff. I even used the term boundary act once and attributed it to you. This was before we started. This is before we started.
Citation is important, Jacob.
Yeah. This is before we became friends. But my theory at the time was that Russia, up until Peter the Great, well, so there was the Byzantine Empire. I called that a breakaway civilization of the Roman Empire, and because it was situated in Turkey, it was kind of mushed together by the East and by Europe, and so it sort of had its own like hybrid kind of flair in a sense. That's what gave it its aesthetic, and it also had its own sort of socio-political view because it was a continuation of the Roman Empire, but it was not the same culture as the Roman Empire, not a continuation of Greco-Roman civilization, because especially because even going back to like the 800s, there's always been a tradition in the West of like a separation between church and state, for the lack of a better term, like the temporal power and earthly power. Temporal power and heavenly power. And then you had in the Middle East, where it was church and state were one effectively under the Caliphate. And then the Eastern Roman Empire following 395, as it was the church. The state controls the church. So it's kind of like a little bit of an in-between with that. And so, but it also produced its own cultural flair. So my theory, or the idea I proposed, still playing around with it, don't know we'll have to see how this plays out, see if I'm going to have to get rid of that idea. But that after the Turks ended up conquering Constantinople, that the focal point of what was left of that Byzantine breakaway civilization moved up to Russia. And then with the coming of Peter the Great and the westernization of it, that killed like the remnants of sort of the Byzantine soul, so to speak. And since then, but then I also incorporated the idea of there being a Russian, like an independent Russian Slavic culture, like sort of a Dugan-esque type thing that was trying to emerge, but the West was suppressing it. And there's sort of like a three-way cultural battle going on between the Russians who are in terms of their worldview, Westerners, the Russians who still have that old Orthodox Byzantine mindset, and then the Russians like Dugin who want sort of an independent Russia. So that was kind of my theory of it. So I mean, I guess it can work with Spengler too. Like you can reconcile them a bit, but I'm starting to question my own theory now, and I'm like, oh crap, Spengler might be proven right again.
Yeah, it's not that far off though, because Spengler.
I don't like how he lumps it in with the Magian personally.
I was just going to point that out, that he lumps the Byzantine in with the Magian, but that's
a bit reductive, I think.
It's arguable. Toynbee separates them, but his basis for it, whether he's right or wrong, is that the world as cavern is what the Byzantine civilization inherited, because you think of Hagia Sophia, it's a giant mosque, basically. So it is culturally consistent with the mosque world as cavern Magian mentality. That's his primary, even though it's Greek speaking, but that's his primary reason for including it as part of the Magian. And plus,
is it possible that idea of the world as a cavern or the world like as a dome actually has its roots back in ancient Mesopotamia with the idea of the firmament and the world? No, okay, no connection.
No, because Spengler's point is that a civilization's primary cosmology, whatever its Ur symbol is, let's say, as he calls it, is evident in its architecture. And architecture is the primary place that you first want to go looking for it first. And in Sumer, we don't have the world as cavern. We have ziggurats that are stepped.
Okay.
Steps leading up
because
to the god.
They thought that literally
you have to climb steps.
If you built it, then you go up and meet God. And that's like the Genesis 11 where it was talking about God comes down to meet.
And there's nothing inside of a ziggurat. They're solid. There's not even any tombs as there is with the Egyptian pyramids.
My theory has always been because of the flooding, there were no mountains in the alluvial plains. And so there was possibly a practical use for them to, in the terms of flooding, maybe like escape to or get like livestock and goods up behind it. I don't know.
No, it doesn't work that way. With huge monumental architecture is always motivated primarily by religious ideas.
No, I just mean like originally, because I remember you wrote in your book, I forget which one it was, but you talked about the idea of early tools and the farming. I think it was like the idea of the hoe there was both a practical and a spiritual reason for it. And I remember you said something about it. It was like almost like a sexual act, fertilizing the field and everything.
Yep, absolutely. But the religious idea comes first and makes the physical implement possible secondarily. Like with sickles, let's take sickles. So in that book, this is my book, Myths, Gods, Machines. So a sickle initially, if you look at them, very often they were made by the Natufians about 10,000 BC in the Levant. And they are in the shape, they've taken a rib from a gazelle and they've used bitumen to glue little flint chips that look like teeth into that rib. And so as they're cutting away the grain, the analogy is to, the gazelle used their jaws to eat the wheat, as we borrow the metaphysical symbolism of the sickle to do the cutting of the grain. So then over time, the metaphysical aspect of it is lost. And pretty soon they stop putting individual flint teeth in, and then they just make it one razor sharp continual edge. So now they're thinking pragmatically, and they've lost the metaphysics of it. So it's no longer the jaw of the gazelle cutting down. And the same thing can be said with the hoe and the thunderbolt, the initial thunderbolts that were very possibly, that go all the way back to the Acheulean hand axe that goes well back into the Paleolithic, like 1.5 million years ago, where these beautifully made Paleolithic hand axes that don't show any signs of wear, but they're made of a great aesthetic appreciation that's way over what would be needed for the pragmatics of using these things. And it's in this distribution, the distribution of the Acheulean hand axe goes from Europe over to India, which is precisely the zone of what later becomes the Indo-Aryan sky god thunder hurlers, who use hammers, Thor's hammer, the Vajra, all these thunderbolts. So it looks pretty clear that the hand axe initially was the thunderbolt of the god, and that was what its symbolism was. And then so that transforms over time. And then once again, there's a semantic depletion of the original metaphysics that it gets lost. So most technology does not come into being for pragmatic purposes. It starts with mythological, metaphysical controlling symbolism that then brings it into being. And then over time, it gets forgotten and then it becomes pragmatized. Just like a sort of Spenglerian culture cycle in miniature.
I mean, I guess sometimes we can't help but think in those empirical ways just because of our...
Because we're taught in this civilization from kindergarten on that to think that
a very
it's a form of brainwashing that you gradually have to just cleanse out.
The whole Daniel Dennett worldview, like Daniel Dennett talking about, everything arises from like these. I mean, and it's
economic necessity or something like Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is totally laughable and ridiculous.
Yeah, I actually liked parts of Guns, Germs, and Steel, but I think you could use parts of it to explain some things, but as a big explanation of how the world works, I think it's very I don't know, it's very it's compared to Spengler, it's like a freshman college essay.
More like a kindergarten scribbling.
Yeah, no, but speaking of the ziggurat for a second, it's like interesting. So we talked about how like in these civilizations, eventually traditions or architecture or whatever or art divorces itself from the sort of metaphysical spiritual foundation. So one of the most underrated stories, I think, in the Bible, for example, Genesis 11, about the construction of the tower. And it's all they're talking about, let us bake brick and bake it thoroughly. Let us build ourselves a great temple so we can make a name for ourselves. And it's almost like in that time, no longer they're making it for God, but instead they're doing it just these big building projects to honor themselves. And you almost notice like the difference between like the ziggurats of Ur versus the older Uruk white temple, which is a lot more modest, but also less gaudy and almost more real in a sense. But so I'd almost wonder if that sort of marks that transition away, breaking away from the kind of their death of God sort of. And I am convinced that there is a link between Genesis 11 and the Epic of Gilgamesh 100% after studying both, but that's a completely different conversation though.
My reading of Genesis 11 would then be that it's a Rube's caricature of a ziggurat. So at that point, this is in the pre-cultural phase of the Magian civilization, which we should clarify for the audience is the Abrahamic civilization. It's Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and Spengler.
The Persians, you'd say, or King Solomon.
The Persians, I guess Spengler does group the Persians in there. That's even more.
I separate two stages personally. Like with a decline and another rise. So
the Tower of Babel is a Rube's caricature of a ziggurat because the Hebrews at this point, you have to remember, are just these wandering, ignorant tribes. They're illiterate. They have no literacy. They see the big city skyscraper in the distance, and they caricaturize it as the gods storming, or the men storming the heavens to take heaven. It's totally ridiculous. That's not what ziggurats are. They're about individual humans ascending to meet the gods who are thought to come down to meet them at the top of the temple, just like in the ending of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, when the mothership lands at Devil's Mountain, which is a late naive pop culture echo of what began in civilization with the ziggurats. So that's my reading of the Genesis.
Oh yeah, I think they're gonna be different. I think it's a mixture of a lot of different, especially because it's like the whole tradition is like, Moses wrote all these things, and that's how. Of course, that's a meta narrative. But that was like the old. That's what the like literalists think. But there's the but like likely how the Torah started as an oral tradition that changed over time. Then you got the documentary hypothesis, and of like the priest, and then there was the I forget the basic. But then I feel like a lot of those stories though could be like a mix of just a bunch of different influences and ideas and sort of stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of Mesopotamian stories are in there mixed with Egyptian stories. There's almost not one Hebrew story in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis specifically, that you can come up with that doesn't have a Mesopotamian precedent for it.
Yeah. The Song of Solomon, I think it was. There's a part of it talks about Yahweh slaying a dragon, which is basically Marduk versus the chaos.
It is.
And that's what people who are like super biblically illiterate, who take like everything literally, they don't realize it's a bunch of different books. It's an anthology of a bunch of different things put into one. But
they forget that the Jews were taken captive by the Babylonians to the Euphrates, to Mesopotamia, where they absorbed the basics of Sumero-Akkadian Babylonian literature, and brought that back with them when Cyrus restored them. The Persians restored them to their homeland. That's when they started synthesizing all this stuff together.
I feel like every single culture in history, they have not gotten a break. They've probably had it one of the worst. Like it starts with Egypt, and then after the Egyptians they get freed, and then after that then the Assyrians and Babylonians come and they get freed, and then the Romans expel them, and then they're wandering around, and then something's brewing in Germany. Now it's by the rivers of Babylon. Now it's by the rivers of Auschwitz and stuff like it's very cyclical and poetic. But back to Russia.
That explains Israel's ferocity in defending its turf.
Yeah, always had that it's not the best word to say, but that very sort of you know what I mean when I say that, like that sort of the ferocity.
Absolutely.
But back to Russia though. I don't want to get too much off topic. What's your take on the situation going on in Ukraine right now? Because, and also when would you also say that Russia, or embryonic Russia, was founded? Because the whole claim for their claim for Ukraine, what they justify it on is, because Russia was born in Ukraine and with the Kievan Rus and stuff. What civilization would they be a part of? Would they have any link to the modern Russian civilization? And then I also hear people talking about there being Mongol influence in Russia, but I feel like that might be a bit overemphasized. Like I don't know if I buy into that entirely. Not super well versed in Russian history, just the geopolitical aspects of it. But just in general, what would your assessment of all that be?
Well, I mean, Kiev was the birthplace of Russia. I don't think there's any question about it, because it was founded in 880 by Swedish Vikings, who put the Rurikids in power there, Prince Rurik. And then it became Kievan Rus, which had a north to south axis almost as far as the Baltic, and included Novgorod, actually. So it had a north-south axis. And that lasted from 880 to 1240, when then the Mongols then come in from the Siberian steppe, and they come in, the swarm, and then take over Kievan Rus. And then for the next few centuries, from 1240 down to 1480, with Ivan III, they have to pay taxes and tribute to the Mongols, Mongols/Tatars, same thing. They have to pay taxes and tribute. So undoubtedly there was some influence from the Mongols there. I'm sure that there was. It's not 100%.
The Mongols were like an empire without a civilization or a culture.
Yeah,
just like why they got eaten. They just got eaten.
Barbarian horde. Let's face it. It's
like
not
the Huns.
There's nothing vertical about it. It's a strictly horizontal barbarian horde.
I had a professor who was once who was talking about how, like, the Tsarist institutions. I didn't quite get his argument, but talking about how the Tsarist institutions, especially under the Romanovs, was heavily influenced by Mongol political institutions, but it seems far more like the French court as opposed to just like
Well, it could
Mongol.
just as well have come from the Vikings, though, too, because we've got Swedish Vikings coming in and establishing both Novgorod and Kiev in the south. Prince Oleg with Novgorod first, and then with Kiev with Prince Rurik. The autocratic aspect might have come from the Vikings. It need not necessarily be attributed to the Mongols, but I'm sure there was some influence from the Mongols, no doubt about that. But then Byzantium too, because with right around 980, Vladimir then imports Orthodox Christianity. So he becomes Orthodox, and from that point on, because he admired it, and you have to think of Orthodox Christendom at that point was extremely cosmopolitan, which is one of the reasons why Spengler groups it in with the Magian civilization, because it represents for him the late Hellenistic cosmopolitan phase of Magian civilization, extraordinarily cosmopolitan, where you've got these Rubes to the north, these Russian tribal Rubes who can't get along with each other and are constantly fighting. And Byzantium is looking down on them. And
the Mycenaeans to the Minoans.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. Same exact analogy. So then with the Ivan III and the final expulsion of the Tatars in 1480, then they start reconsolidating and getting their sense of themselves back. And then he takes back the land of Kiev and Rus from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that in the meantime had taken it. So they take it back, Kiev and Rus, Novgorod, and all of that. And Russia begins to expand. And all it does from that point is expand. It moves into Siberia in the 16th century, in the 1580s, when a Cossack ruler or a Cossack, overlord, tribal chieftain, whatever, leads the Russian expanse into Siberia, which is a very easy conquest for them at that point. You have to consider.
That's just out of pride, really, like just Siberia, because there's like nothing that was it kind of more just based on honor and pride that they wanted to expand there, even though there was barely anything there.
No, I think it was immunological. It's defending most of this expansion, east and west with Russia, whether into Ukraine, whether to the east, is based on the fact that geographically you're stuck with very flat plain, which is very difficult to defend from invasion, as Russia learned from the Mongol invasions. So if you extend it west to the Carpathians, which is the western border of Ukraine, and you extend it east to the Urals, you've got those two mountain range as natural buffers. And that's what Russia has tried to do all along, because flat steppe land is very difficult to defend. The thing about steppe land, and this is one of the maybe 2 points from Jared Diamond's book that I liked, is that in flat steppe land, people can move east to west, west to east very quickly, very fast, way faster than geographically north to south, where there's a lot more, there's different climates, a lot more striated space in the way. So it's much slower going than east to west and west to east across those plains with horseback riders. It goes very fast.
Except in the U.S.
Except for the U.S.?
I said, except for because you have the Great Plains north to south, and then you have to go over like two big mountain ranges in order to get to.
You got the Rocky Mountains in the middle there dividing everything, and
and
exactly.
It's
only flat from the Rockies, to the Appalachians. So anyway, so it was very important for them immunologically to do this, to take Siberia, which at that point was very easy to do, and they did it very quickly. So you have to keep in mind that Russia is used to winning. It has lost very, very few conflicts. Most people don't know this, that other than the Mongols coming in and conquering them, and Moscow was burned twice, once around 1382 after Dmitry Donskoy in 1380 was the first to prove that you could defeat the Tatars. There was a little battle there that he had in 1380, and he defeated the Tatars, and everybody's like, oh, they can be defeated. So 2 years later, the Tatars come back, they sack Moscow and teach them a lesson. But it put in their minds in Moscow that they could be defeated. It's all a matter of getting everyone on the same plane and organized, which they then did do. And by a century later with Ivan III in 1480, that's it. The Tatars are done. And it's just expansion from that point. You get Catherine the Great in 1792, annexing Crimea. And then 3 years later, she carves up Poland with Austria and Prussia. They carve up Poland. Poland had been trying to take land away. Poland and Russia have been at war forever. They're like France and Germany. During
Speaking of France, I just want to say something real quick. Just because you said Russia always wins, so like how the
not always, no, they're used to winning, but not there are exceptions. Yeah,
but you know how France, the joke is they always lose. So why does France have so many civil wars?
Why?
So they can win something every once in a while.
A civil war, yes.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I just wanted.
So I was just going to say, so she carves out Poland. They take Poland, which does not have independence until after World War I. After that, then in 1801, Alexander I annexes Georgia. Really, the only loss was then the Crimean War in 1853 to 56, when they did lose the Crimean War and they lost some territory there. There haven't been many losses, and Russia is just used to winning until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so part of what Putin has in his mind with what he's doing is and Putin himself in his own career is used to winning, going into Georgia, taking Crimea. He's used to winning, and Russia's used to winning. So this Western wishful thinking that Russia's on its last legs, it's not. It's just getting warmed up. The loss of the Soviet Union was a restructuring. Every civilization goes through a restructuring where they have a certain structure disintegrates and they have to reconsolidate it. But Russia's in its springtime, which means it's fundamentally powerful, fundamentally vital, and on the way up. Putin isn't going to lose in the Ukraine. That's my prediction. It's not going to be a loss. But you listen to Western media, and because it's all about hate Russia, hate Russia, hate Russia, which has been going on now for decades, and there's so much hypocrisy. Putin's on his last leg. Putin keeps making strategical errors in Ukraine. Not for long. Not for long. He's going to win it. And I've even heard some more sensible-headed Westerners talk about how they realize, some of the more sensible people realize that he's going to win.
And I remember
there's a lot of propaganda going on, wishful thinking, vilification, and demonization that's not based on reality whatsoever. And it's based on a total misperception and misunderestimation completely of Russia's strength right now.
And then, so like, I am by no means a fan of Fox News. They're awful. It's junk food. But I know, like, for instance, I think it was Tucker Carlson recently or something was getting
one of the few
was getting slammed because they're saying he's pro-Russia just for saying Russia's probably gonna win.
No, that's not pro-Russia, and I'm not pro-Russia or pro-West either. I'm just interested in a neutral, objective viewpoint, which you can't have if you've got all this emotional investment in the West and in the victory and triumph of democracy as the unipolar vision and the only right way of existence. That's totally wrong. That's ridiculous. It's totally ridiculous. It's completely biased.
And the idea of like universal human rights, it's very Eurocentric. It's just
which is usually a facade, a front for a culture to get in and gain power over another culture.
That's why there's no such thing. International socialism never worked.
Like Syria was a front for the U.S. to get involved in what was apparently a humanitarian crisis, but it was a bid, a nice cover for U.S. to get in there and proxy fight Russia for control over the Middle East. I see right through that shit. It's
Regarding Iraq, what do you think that was? Like, do you think, like, I mean, some of the there's the narrative, oh, we're going to go spread democracy. Then there's the weapons of mass destruction. Oh, it was an accident. And then there's it was actually about oil, that sort of thing. Where do you stand on that? Because I feel like
all of that is involved in there. Getting control of the oil was definitely a huge motive, and getting revenge for 9/11 was another motive, even though Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. But it had to be demonstrated to the world stage that Saddam Hussein must have had weapons of mass destruction and must have been involved in 9/11 when he had nothing to do with it. And actually, Saddam Hussein was stabilizing Iraq. He was Ba'athist. He wasn't religious. He didn't side with Sunni or Shia. And when he came into power, yes, it was with some proscriptions. That's a fact, as is the case with any dictator. But nonetheless, he put everybody to work. He had schools up and running.
He also counterbalanced Assad.
Yeah, exactly. The place was functioning. It was fine. You knock him out, then look what you've got. His army is now an insurgency. They're out of work. They have no money. The whole place becomes a total disaster because
his officers went and helped. His officers joined ISIS just because they had nothing else to do.
Oh yeah, yeah, exactly. They're bored. They're out of work. They have no money. What do you expect them to do?
It was like when Trump said Obama created ISIS. Like,
yeah, no, they're
it's not
very
wrong
possibly.
necessarily.
Both Bush and Obama to create ISIS.
Especially Bush, I'd say.
Same thing in Afghanistan. We're there for 20 years fighting goat herders, and we lose. Now, how do you think we're going to
Saigon all over again?
Yeah, how do you think we're going to do against Russia? Goat herders. Russia is not goat herders. You can't push Russia around. It's not Iraq. You cannot bully them. They are at least as powerful as the West. They're part of the global triumvirate with China. They're all equally powerful. And the United States thinks that it can just bully Russia. It's not going to happen. So there's a lot of wishful thinking going on in the media about this.
It
doesn't correspond with an accurate assessment of reality. It just doesn't.
The Taliban had their Armenius moment.
Basically. Yeah, and look what happened. So we leave Syria. Assad's still in power, just like he was when we went in there. And in that case, we were backing Al-Qaeda, who had changed their name to Jabhat al-Nusra, changed their name, but still Al-Qaeda, and we're funding them against both Assad and ISIS. Did get rid of ISIS under Trump, so a minor victory there. But Assad's still in power. We live in Afghanistan. The Taliban's still in power. After 20 years of fighting goat herders. Interesting. We leave Iraq, and it's in ruins. No goal there. Nothing established. Nothing. So this is the administration you want to trust. You want to trust the U.S. government to get us into a shooting hot war with one of the most powerful nations on this planet? Good luck. You have my sympathies. It's not going to turn out well. I guarantee it. It's not going to turn out well.
Regarding Iraq, and I am like, I guess this is my conspiracy theory, and I'm only half joking because I actually feel like this may have been the case. So you said Saddam Hussein wasn't religious, which nominally speaking, I don't think is true. But part of it, I don't know. I don't even know what I'm basing this. I'm basing it just on a couple things he said here and there. I think he may have been. There may have been something going on in the works to try to resurrect the cult of Marduk or something. I feel like he thought he was a reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Which is it. So it almost makes me wonder, maybe he was, if it had been left alone, because
that's just a power fantasy and ego.
Yeah. Because I was just saying, it was just kind of interesting to think about, like, Islamic civilization died back like a couple hundred years ago. So like there's that vacuum there. It's in a dark age. What will come out of it next? Who knows?
Yeah, this is what Spengler calls a fellaheen society. After a big civilization disintegrates, and you're left with these campfire nomads. That's basically what Iraq was under Saddam Hussein.
Mm-hmm. I remember seeing a video where the guy was predicting, or not predicting, but he was suggesting the idea that there could be like a pseudomorphosis there, and these terrorist groups we're seeing, like ISIS, for example, they're stuck in that Islamic pseudomorphosis, but they're the equivalent of potentially another rising civilization there. They'd be the Merovingians of that, like the roaming barbarians who are trying to establish their own state, but then eventually it might break away from that whole caliphate idea and be something. It was interesting, but I don't think there's enough corroborating evidence to suggest that might be the case.
It seems like the Middle East is in what's called a Volkerwanderung, which is the period with the Vikings, and even before that, from the Merovingian to the Vikings, just tribal warfare. That's all it is. There's no sense of a civilization with verticality, with hierarchy, monumental architecture. But there is in Russia. They got their shit together. They know what they're doing. They have a clear identity. They're strong. They're in their springtime. This is not a society you want to fuck with, in my opinion.
So what do you think is going to happen next with Russia?
Well, most likely, my guess is with what Putin is doing, he's going to take the eastern half of Ukraine up to the Dnieper, including Kiev. Because Dugin prophesied this. He said that if the West doesn't quit with flirting with NATO, with Ukraine, Georgia, whoever, because they've expanded as far east as we're going to let them expand, it's not going to go any further. And even though Ukraine was 5 years or so away from joining NATO, because it's so drenched and saturated in corruption that even NATO is like, you guys clean up your shit before we're going into that restroom. That's not going to happen.
It's okay if we press onto your border, but not okay when you do that to us.
Yeah, exactly. So
South China Sea too.
My guess is he's going to take everything up to the Dnieper. because Dugin predicted that there would be two Ukraines if this happened. That only makes sense if you're talking about taking Kiev, which is on the Dnieper, and taking everything east of that. The west of it is mostly Ukrainian speaking anyway, but is mostly composed of neo-Nazi nationalists. And this is a thing that when Putin announced
Azov,
yeah, the Azov battalion, but there's way more than that. That's just one thing. There's way more than that. Ukraine, since the Nazis went in there in the 1940s, there was a guy named Stefan Bandera who led a movement, a Ukrainian nationalist movement, in alliance with the Nazis against the Russians, who committed genocide. He organized huge acts of genocide against Jews, Poles, and Russians, killed tens of thousands of each of them. And the flag of the OUN that he founded is black and red, which is still flown today by protesters bearing torches, walking in the streets. And the guy, what was the president who was in 2004, Yushchenko, wanted to make Bandera a national hero. And he was president from 2004 to 2010. He ousted Yanukovych. Then Yanukovych comes in 2010. But he wanted to make Bandera, this genocidal, ethnic cleansing, Western Ukraine guy, a national hero. Totally pathetic. And most the Western liberal media is not going to
Vlad the Impaler.
I learned this from Oliver Stone, from his biography, his documentary on Ukraine, because Stone doesn't buy the Western bullshit propaganda. He digs deep. So I found this out. And so there are all these neo-Nazi groups, such as the Right Sector, Svoboda, Trident, a bunch of them. And in the Maidan Revolution, even, which took place in 2014, this was a revolution of neo-Nazis who took control over the Ukrainian government, and they were backed by, guess who? Vice President Biden, Victoria Nuland, neocon John McCain, and John Kerry all made trips over to Ukraine, financed the Maidan Revolution of neo-Nazis. They gained control, and they put a weak president in there who was just a neo-Nazi puppet. I've forgotten his name, but for 150 days he was in there before Poroshenko came in there. And Poroshenko had ties also with neo-Nazis anyway. And so too, I am convinced that Zelensky also does, because the mayor.
I mean, Russia, he's considered like a liberal in Ukraine, but it's like their Overton window is way farther to the right than in the US.
Oh, yeah.
Like compared to the US, Zelensky's like to the right of Trump.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah. So it's a matter of perspective here with Zelensky. No. And so, the West has just bought this hook, line, and sinker, at least the dumb West, the cattle people in the West. The American government knows very well what's going on and is guilty of the same kinds of hypocrisy that went on when they supported the Mujahideen against the Russians in Afghanistan in the 80s, and supported Al-Qaeda against Assad and ISIS in that war. And now they're going to try to do the same thing and support neo-Nazi contingents against Russia, because the CIA have been using the neo-Nazi contingents since after the end of World War II.
As long as you hate who we hate, then we're going to fund you no matter how evil you are.
So there's no.
Yet you cry about all those fringe Nazi groups in the U.S. that have absolutely no power, and talking about how they're like the biggest threat to democracy. These same institutes, they're covertly funding these.
It's just one long chain of hypocrisy, lies, and it's wagging the tail, wagging the dog. There's a lot of that going on here, and I'm not buying any of it. I see through it, and the left and right have both joined the warmongering bandwagon that we need to support the Ukrainians. Yeah, support them. The longer you support them, the more of them are going to get killed, because Russia's going to win. You can't. There's no way in which you can balance a mathematical equation of Ukraine versus Russia. Ukraine has a chance. No, it does not. Not a chance in hell. And if we went to war against Mexico, the odds would be about the same for Mexico. Not going to win. Not going to happen.
It's funny because like during, so like where I live, especially like where I go to school, a lot of the professors, since studying government, a lot of the professors are actually, like, especially in the international relations departments, had worked at the State Department before. And what's interesting, they have consistently said something that shocked me at the time when I heard it. Then I started looking into it. I'm like, oh my God, it's right. But the media did not want to talk about this in the Trump administration because it didn't work for their narrative. But Trump was actually the most anti-Russian president since JFK in terms of his policy against, except he wasn't being overtly hawkish. He was funding all these groups, like arming neo-Nazis in Ukraine, for example, like even more than Obama. And then briefly, even though the Chechnya thing, it's not really around anymore, he tried funding the Chechens, the Chechens too, trying to like sort of stir up animosity with them against Russia. But it's just interesting, like all of these people I've talked to, like again, who've worked in foreign policy and know what's going on, have consistently said, yeah, no, don't listen to what, for instance, the mainstream media is saying about Trump being like a Russian stooge or whatever. And this isn't me defending Trump or me criticizing Trump or anything, but it's just interesting. Like Obama was softer on Russia than Trump was.
Well, Dugan said recently in an interview just a few days ago that if Trump had been president, this would not have happened. Because if Trump had been president, because he respected Russia and he didn't put all this pressure on them. He was willing to treat them as equals and drop all this ridiculous vilification, which is that we've had decades of. It's total comic book Rambo caricature of Russia. I'm not buying it. I'm too sophisticated for that. And Russia is too great of a civilization to simply ride off as some backwoods Saddam, Iraq. You know, these aren't goat herders. That's not the case. This is a highly sophisticated, very erudite civilization with an incredible body of literature, art, culture. This is not somebody you're going to push around. That's not going to happen. And so the outcome is going to be that the West is going to have to just let Russia take Ukraine. There's no two ways about that. I don't see any other way about it. No one's going to escalate this to a nuclear conflict. Neither Putin nor the West has any interest in that. It's suicidal for both sides to do anything like that. So that puts certain stoppages on the degree to which either NATO or America can get involved in this conflict, and they know it. Zelensky made a huge mistake in thinking that Big Daddy West would come to his rescue. And I think he's kind of like the kid who hangs out with the teacher, he's the teacher's pet, and the bullies are after him. But then when he's around the teacher, he flips him the finger. Wait till you get away from the teacher after school. See what happens to you. Zelensky has that same kind of mentality. And now he's in for a huge disillusionment. He totally miscalculated the West and NATO's protection of Ukraine, which is only a political tool that the West and NATO has used to get at Putin and Russia. He totally miscalculated, but he's not very bright. I mean, it doesn't surprise me because the guy's a comedian. He came from TV shows on Ukraine. He only got elected because he was a celebrity, and he thought it would just be fun and
Trump,
games.
kind of.
Just fun and games. But except Trump's not naive, though. Zelensky is naive. He's one of these types of celebrities who has unlike Trump, has no reality sense. He's had a pampered bubble of money around him and has no sense for realpolitik. And so he thought it would just be fun and games and easy. Everybody loves him. That's not going to hack it when it comes to dealing with somebody like a realpolitik, politician like Putin, where
I think he forgets that the name of his
spots one weakness, he's going straight for the jugular.
He forgets that the name of his country is literally the border country, and that means something. It's not going to be easy to run a country that was essentially created to be a buffer between two great. It's like he's So I mean, I can respect Zelensky at least for kind of stepping up. Like, I don't know. I think
he's a moron.
I mean, I don't think he's like good at politics, but in terms of as a figurehead,
if he was good at politics, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of his citizens would not be dying right now, and they're dying because he's a weak president. That's the sad thing here. When you get a weak leader in, people die. You get a strong leader in, they don't. That's the leader's job, is to create a shield for his population. This metaphor goes all the way back to the Sumerians, where you have a strong Ensi, what was called there an Ensi, a ruler who is the shepherd of his flock, and his job is to preserve and protect that flock. And the bad rulers were the ones who didn't do that, so they got ousted or assassinated pretty quickly.
Like a David and Solomon, and then Solomon's kids were weak leaders too in Israel. And
we've got some major weak leaders right now with Biden and with Zelensky. They're equally weak, equally corrupt. Let's face it, Biden with Hunter Biden and the laptop, equally corrupt.
Oh, did you hear about that? Now CNN is reporting on it because it turned out that CNN, they were originally the ones doing cover for Hunter Biden, but now they've done, it's like them, or I forget if it's CNN or MSNBC, but are actually reporting on the Hunter Biden thing now. And it's like, actually, no, this is real. This has happened. We were wrong. And it kind of like what they did with the lab leak.
CNN's been wrong about a lot of things.
I mean, I just don't think any of these politicians
are quite a bit with their cabinet of pedophile and perverted journalists. They've had to do quite a bit of backtracking.
It's hilarious with that whole Pizzagate thing, which was ridiculous. Which the entire thing was ridiculous, but it turned out with Jeffrey Epstein, there was a little bit of truth to what to the premise behind that whole Pizzagate scandal, where it's like, yes, there definitely is a global pedophile ring going on right now. It's not like what QAnon says it is. It's not like it's that craziness. But
both CNN and also the New York Times recently backtracked too, saying, you know what, the left is kind of restricting freedom of speech right now.
I remember back during the Bush years. Remember during the Bush years?
A few days ago. It's like, has anybody noticed this? Yes, we have noticed it, New York Times. Welcome to the party.
I just think it was hilarious how back during the Bush years, it was the left. They were like the free speech, speech ones. They were the ones who were like, hey, we need to stop with all the war and everything. And then you got the right, who were the harbingers of cancel culture back that they were like cancel Harry Potter, cancel.
That's exactly right.
Cancel.
The right I grew up with was the right of censorship. Get rid of porn, shut down the porn magazines, shut down get rid of offensive works of literature in our libraries and so forth. They were the party of censorship, but it's weird they've totally changed places.
It's almost as if on policy they're the same, but epistemologically they've switched.
Yeah.
So it's just the whole when I see the modern I mean, I think a lot of them are really really cringy, but you see a lot of these new right-wing media type people, millennial, those people starting. It's like a different kind of right-wing vibe. It's almost like they have that sort of left-wing energy, but are applying it to right-wing politics. It's interesting, that sort of. I forget who it was, but it was one of those. It was somebody. I forget who. I've never been a Milo Yiannopoulos fan, but I think it was him who said this. But he was conservatism has become the new counterculture, which I think actually has some truth to it, and some depending on the kind of conservatism.
Well, I remember the right that I grew up with was composed of morons like Rush Limbaugh, which you could not take seriously for 2 seconds.
Presidential Medal of Freedom, that was ridiculous.
The neocons, Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz, Bush Jr., all goofballs and clowns with low IQs. You couldn't take them seriously for a second. But now there's a lot of smart people, like Tucker Carlson was one. He's very high IQ, very perceptive, very sharp, and not afraid to say what he thinks. Even if it goes against the rest of Fox News, or if you watch Greg Gutfeld, which I do for a laugh every now and then.
He was actually an alumni of my fraternity.
Oh wow, interesting. His show is funny, and he's got blacks on there, gays. He's had Caitlyn Jenner on there. Wait a minute, didn't that used to be the left doing stuff like that? I mean, when did blacks and gays and trans men or women, whatever it is, I get confused. I can't keep up. Yeah, infiltrate right-wing talk shows. It's like, I'm confused here. Something is, they've totally changed places. I don't quite get it.
Yeah. There was this one guy, just off topic a second. We always, on the political streams I have, we always he's kind of like an inside joke we make fun of. But there was this commentator I used to like he was kind of like this, oh God, I used to like him. Now I hate him, but his name was Dave Rubin. He was this guy. Yeah, no, he used to be, he was on the left, and then he left the left, according to him. And he's like, yeah, no, I don't like how they're going against free speech and stuff. It's like, okay, like legitimate, that sort of thing. And he starts this show where he's like interviewing people from all across the spectrum, like political spectrum, for free speech. And then but then one day he just realizes, actually, there's more money on the right. So he just changes all of his positions, and it is now and now works for Glenn Beck. It's just not a very bright guy, but just bright enough to know where the money is, but
shrewd enough to
but not insightful at all. Just
no.
Anyway, no, it's just I don't know why I brought him up. It's kind of like he's a meme, but either yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, it's like Tucker Carlson.
Jacob, I got to get some food here. It's 5:00 my time, so I got to get. I guess we've been going 90 minutes.
Do you want to take a break? We could take a break, and then we can.
Probably not. I'm going to sign off for now. I've been working. See, the problem is I've been working all day on this new school.
Absolutely.
Mentally exhausted. Even by the time we got on, I was mentally exhausted. So
okay. Would you by any chance be willing to pick this up? Maybe.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. That's great. Can't do it tomorrow, but I'm free over the weekend or Monday.
I think depending on if I have work, Monday might work. I will reach out to you though, but there's definitely a lot more to talk about on this. So.
Yeah, as always, I'm sure, of course. I just my stomach's growling, so
I feel you.
I better go feed it.
All right, everybody. As always, our friend John David Ebert. If you want to take a look at his works, buy his books, or pay for his Substack articles. I'll do that when I have money, when I am dead broke. So,
all right.
But other than that, it was great talking to you, John. I'll talk to you next time.
Politicrat, absolutely. I look forward to our next conversation. Okay, take care. Have a good night.